Okay, we are in a series on the book of Leviticus. And today, we are going to look at part 4. And the title of the message is The Spirit of the Law. The Spirit of the Law. Do I have any book lovers in the room? Oh yeah, we got some readers, we got some book lovers. When I find out that someone likes to read, or when anyone, when you find out, oh, you like to read, one of the next questions that is often asked is, well, what kind of books do you like to read? What do you like to read? Fiction, nonfiction, and then there's all these categories, or all these genres and subgenres. Thrillers, mystery, crime, romance, whatever. Or nonfiction, biographies, memoirs, political things, and there's so many options when it comes to reading and to books. It's important to remember that the Bible is not just a single book. The Bible is a library of books, 66 different books that make up the Bible, and there are many different genres in this collection of books as well. And I doubt that any of my book lovers in the room would say that their preferred genre of literature is legal codes. Oh yes, I just love to read through the city bylaws of small American towns. Or give me the copies of the codes of conduct for staff at European universities, and I'll stay in bed all day. Or I can't wait to pick up the latest copy of English translations of ancient Near Eastern legal documents. Like, nobody is doing that. But that's exactly what the book of Leviticus is. It's a book of laws for a group of people living in what would be known as Israel, eventually. They're currently, when they get it, they're in the wilderness, but they're heading to Israel about 3,500 years ago. So I forgive you if you struggle to find it interesting at times. It's not anyone's preferred genre, ancient Near Eastern legal codes. But unlike the codes of conduct for staff at European universities or the city bylaws of American small towns, this legal code is part of God's inspired word. And that counts for something. God intended for us to read this. God intended for us to get something from it. And so I believe there is something in this book for us today. Now, it wasn't written to us. I think it's important to understand this. It wasn't written to us. It was written to and for these people, these centuries ago, specifically. But it was written for us in the sense that there is something in it for us. So this is true for the whole Bible, actually. The Bible wasn't written to us. We are not the original audience that this was written for. It was written in a specific time and place for a specific purpose to a specific people. But it was written for us in that God, in his sovereign plan and in his overseeing of all of history, knew that there was something in this book for us today. So, what do we do with this collection of old laws in the book of Leviticus? Well, the first step is to interpret it correctly. We need to understand what we're reading before we can apply it to our lives. And largely the laws of Leviticus, so if we want to understand what we're reading, and you could sort of categorize it, these laws in two main categories. The first is that it's ritual laws or religious laws. And this is what we've been talking about so far in the first 3 parts of this series, as we've looked at, the sacrificial system and the Day of Atonement and all these rules about how to do the religious life of the community. Stuff about ritual purity and the tabernacle and ceremonies and all these things, so that the people could be holy in the presence of a holy God and worship him properly. And we've talked about how all of these ritual laws all look ahead to Jesus, point to Jesus, and were fulfilled by Jesus, praise God, and how they help us understand the meaning of everything that Jesus did for us on the cross. So that's sort of the first main category. And then there's this other main category of laws in the book of Leviticus, which I would say you might call them ethical laws. These are rules and regulations for multiple spheres of life and community intended to help God's people as they go in to set up their new society in accordance with God's good will for them. So there were laws related to the home, laws related to agriculture, which was a big part of life in this ancient culture. Rules for how to operate the legal system and how to have good business practices and personal relationships and how to care for the poor and travelers and all these sorts of things. Rules all over the place. And some of these rules are very weird. Some of these rules, it's like, why on earth does God, why would God make them do that? Or why wouldn't God allow them to do this? Some of them are very confusing. And I think that they're confusing and weird and strange to us because we don't understand necessarily always the original context or the original purpose or intent or the historical reason for why God would give them these unusual laws. I did some Googling, and if you Google weird laws in the world, you can find a lot of strange things. And I haven't been able to really confirm that a lot of these things are actually true. You can't trust everything on the internet, of course. But, you do read about some of these things, and if they are true, they certainly are bizarre. And it's fun to kind of look at some of these weird laws. Why on earth? Okay, so one that appears that I saw on several occasions on different lists of, the top 25 strangest laws in the world, that in some American cities, it is against the law to transport ice cream in your back pocket. Okay, Ezra, can you come up? I have a volunteer here, my assistant. All right. Thank you, Ezra. So we're going to demonstrate. Here we go. This could get messy, folks. All right. We're going to make sure everybody can see. We're going to put an ice cream in the back pocket. Can we get the camera? Can we get a close-up, please, for all the people on YouTube? All right. All right. We're making a mess. All right. So this raises some questions. First off, why would anyone want to put an ice cream in their back pocket? A cone of ice cream in their back. And second of all, why would that be against the law? Okay. Well, it's very confusing, but when you understand the history, it makes sense. So the history of why you can't put an ice cream cone in your back pocket is that in a time when people were riding horses as their main mode of transportation, thieves would put an ice cream cone or something sweet in their back pocket and would walk down the street and walk past horses, and it would attract the horses, and they would leave where they are and follow them, and they would steal horses by this method. Apparently. Allegedly. All right. That's it for that. You can enjoy that, Ezra. My butt ice cream. A little messy. Okay. So, that kind of makes sense, I guess. So the letter of the law, the actual law is don't put ice cream in your back pocket, okay? But the spirit of the law, the point is don't steal. Don't steal your neighbor's mode of transportation or whatever. Don't steal. So the letter of the law, don't put ice cream in your back pocket, but the spirit of the law, don't steal. One of the big ideas that I want us to hear today and to make sense of some of these laws that are very strange to us, to our modern Western minds in the Bible, is that though the laws of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, these first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, and that contains the law, even though these laws are not applicable to us today, they are part of the Old Covenant that is now obsolete, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. And many of them seem bizarre because they're from a totally different culture and a totally different time period. These laws flow from the heart of our unchanging God. And underlying them are principles that are true for all generations. So don't get hung up on the letter of the law. Don't get hung up on, well, why on earth can't they put ice cream in their back pocket. Focus on what is the point. What is the underlying timeless ethical principle behind that law? What's the spirit of the law? What's the heart of God behind this ancient rule? And then the question is, okay, so then what difference does that make for me today? Or how does that affect my life? One of the best examples from Leviticus is Leviticus 19:28, the tattoo verse. Let's read that. It says, "Do not cut your bodies for the dead. Do not mark your skin with tattoos." Well, there it is, right there in the black and white, folks. If you got a tattoo, you are in direct disobedience to God's word. Well, hold on, chill out. Let's think about this. First of all, that's Old Covenant. So, first of all, that doesn't necessarily apply to us. As Hebrews 8:13 says, the Old Covenant is obsolete. It's passed away, and it's been replaced by the New Covenant. So don't worry about that, first of all. But second of all, let's talk about why this law was in place for the people of Israel. Why weren't they allowed to mark their skin with tattoos? Why didn't God want them to do that? Context is very important. Tattooing back then was not an artistic form of self-expression like it is today. It was part of pagan idol worship. People would tattoo themselves to signify their allegiance to their gods, like branding themselves for Baal or Molech or whoever else they were worshiping. And this was how they showed their commitment to their false god. And so that's what this verse is about. The letter of the law is don't mark your skin with tattoos, but the spirit of the law, which is what matters for us, is don't participate in idol worship. Don't pledge allegiance to anyone but the Lord. So, you heard it here, folks, officially. If you want to get a tattoo, go for it. If you can afford it, if you're not getting something inappropriate, if your family supports you and is in agreement with it, and all those other questions that are important to ask, there's nothing sinful about it. So we don't have to follow the letter of the Old Testament law. We are under the New Covenant. Put that ice cream in your pocket. Who cares? But we ought to pay attention to the spirit of the law. And listen to this verse in 2 Corinthians. I like this. He has made us competent to be ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit produces life. The new covenant is all about the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law, the principles behind the law, they actually produce life in us. They help us to live. As much as we might just want to skip this material in Leviticus because it's not our preferred genre, don't skip it, because God wants you to live, to truly live in alignment with His life. And the more that we understand the spirit of the law, the heart of God behind these rules, the more we can learn to align ourselves with His heart. And the better life will go for us when we are in alignment with God, the heart of God. Right? It's like you don't want to go against the grain, you might get a splinter. Well, let's go with the grain of God's heart and desires and design for the world always. And so that means that we need to understand what God's good design and desires are. Okay, so in Leviticus chapter 19, specifically, we come across some of these laws that seem pretty weird, and also a bunch of laws that seem pretty normal. And these make up the bulk of the ethical laws in the book of Leviticus in chapter 19. And these deal with the kind of people that God wanted them to be and us to be, and not so much the rules for religious rituals and whatnot. In every case, these ethical laws or the similar ethical principles underlying these laws are repeated in the New Testament or in the teaching of Jesus or in the apostles in one way or another. So, which makes sense because they flow from the heart of God. So even though they're Old Testament commandments, part of the Old Covenant, and that we are not required to follow to the letter as New Testament, New Covenant people, the ethical principles still apply today. So what we're going to do today is quickly, we're going to review some of the ethical laws found in Leviticus 19 and draw out the spirit of the law, the moral principles behind them. And we're going to group them together in these broad categories: matters of family, matters of faithfulness to God, matters related to compassion and justice and fairness, speech, and treatment of neighbor. So today we're just going to look at the first three of those categories, and next Sunday we will look at the other three. So first off, matters of family that we find taught to us in Leviticus chapter 19. Okay, Leviticus 19 verse 3. We'll start there. It simply says, each of you must show great respect for your mother and father. Well, that sounds familiar because that's also in the Ten Commandments. It's one of the Ten Commandments. To honor and show respect to your mother and father. Doesn't mean you always have to agree with them, but it does mean to treat them with respect. Matters of family. Treat your parents with respect. Verse 29. Let's keep going. Verse 29 says, do not defile your daughter by making her a prostitute, or the land will be filled with prostitution and wickedness. Now again, this is one of those things where it's like, well, you know, there's not too many dads out there that are going and putting their daughters out on the street corner. Like, this is a little bit irrelevant for modern life. But what's the spirit of this law? The spirit of this law is protect your daughters. Protect your children from the people out there who are predators. And so if you have children, are you taking steps to protect them against predators on the internet and traffickers? And you know, I know Pam and Kevin can tell you all about the reality of that in our world today. There really is a trafficking issue here. What's the age, Pam, that most girls are first trafficked? 12, 13. That's the average age that girls begin to be trafficked into sexual trafficking. So, guys, it's a reality. Do you monitor what your kids are doing online? Do you have their passwords? Do you know who they're talking to? These are really important things. So back in Leviticus, it was don't make your daughter a prostitute. But the principle is today, how are we protecting our daughters and our children? Verse 32, let's read that one. Verse 32 says, stand up in the presence of the elderly and show respect for the aged. I like that. I like how that's worded. Stand up in honor of the elderly when they enter the room. And maybe that's also stand up because they need a place they need to sit down. So stand, give your chair to the old person. Honor the elderly. This is a good lesson for us today as well. I think that it's a generational thing, but I think young people they need to learn to respect their elders. I think this is something we can learn well from our First Nations neighbors. They have a culture of honoring elders, of listening. I remember one time in my previous community, we were doing a vacation Bible school on the First Nations Reserve near our community, and I had asked an elder from the community. She's actually the oldest living elder of Tobic First Nation. I invited her to come. She's a believer, part of my church there. I said, would you come and read scripture to the children during vacation Bible school? And so you know what a VBS is like. If you haven't, let me tell you, it's chaos, right? It's like kids are running around, it's crazy, it's wild. But the second that Henrietta came, they were silent. And I asked them to sit on the floor, and they sat down, and she came, and she sat, and she opened the Word, and she read, and you could hear a pin drop. And I was just, wow, these kids, they don't care about me. But as soon as an elder speaks, they listen. That's a good lesson. I think that we could take some good wisdom from that. Okay, so matters related to family. This matters to God. Matters of faithfulness to the Lord is the next broad category. Verse 4 of chapter 19 says, do not put your trust in idols or make metal images of gods for yourselves. I am the Lord, your God. Now, idolatry was a real problem back then. Literally worshiping actual figurines that they would carve and whatnot. Now, today, we don't see a lot of that happening, but we do have idol worship in many different ways. People idolizing money and work and habits and addictions, or political leaders, or celebrities, or they're obsessed with sports teams, or whatever it might be. Things that we worship in the place of God are idols. And some of us are guilty of idol worship from time to time. Verse 31, let's continue. It says this: "Do not defile yourselves by turning to mediums or to those who consult the spirits of the dead." Okay, no using mediums. This was not allowed in ancient culture, and it still happens today to some degree that people will, try to find these people that claim to speak to the dead. This is something that we should steer clear of. But what's the underlying issue here? I would say two things. Number one, people would and still do turn to people like this, mediums and other people like that, to try to find comfort in their grief. And the scriptures tell us that God is the God of all comfort. He should be all we need to rely on when we are grieving, not some false and misleading and potentially demonic source of comfort. So steer clear. And the second thing I would say is that people consult mediums, or would consult mediums, to try to get wisdom or insight into decisions that they need to make for direction. And we should trust and consult the Lord. He is all-knowing, and He will never lead us astray. So trust the Lord. Trust Him to provide for you what you need. This is the underlying concept here. Okay, so matters of family, matters of faithfulness to God. And then the third broad category of some of these laws we see in Leviticus 19 are matters of compassion. Verses 9 and 10. God instructed the people of Israel, "When you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your fields, and do not pick up what the harvesters drop. It is the same with your grape crop. Do not strip every last bunch of grapes from the vines, and do not pick up the grapes that fall to the ground. Leave them for the poor and the foreigners living among you. I am the Lord your God." This is the law of gleanings, it was called, that the farmers in that time were to leave the leftovers for the poor. I used to work on a farm when I was growing up. I think 10 different summers I worked at this orchards, apples, peaches, plums, pears, cherries. It was awesome. It was great work, hard work, and I had a lot of great times there. When I started, the first job that I had was picking drops. All right, these are the drop apples. These are the ones that after everyone has done the main picking of the good apples, then they get these kids, like 12 years old, like I was, with buckets and down in the mud and the dirt under the tree with buckets just scooping up the drop apples. And you know what they were for? No, apple juice. That's right, folks. Your Graves' apple juice is made of apples off the ground. But they clean them. It's fine. Yeah, so like they try to, smart farmers, maximize their profits. Everything that nothing goes to waste, right? You try to maximize. But God said to them in ancient Israel, don't try to maximize your profits. That's not as important. It's not about being wealthy and as successful as you can be. The poor matter too. And so God gave them a rule that said, don't pick up the drops. Don't get every single last grape off your vines. Save that, leave that for the poor. In the story of Ruth in the Old Testament, you might remember that Ruth and Naomi, they go to Bethlehem, and they're poor, and they survive off the gleanings from Boaz's field in that area. So because he was following that law. The idea is to give of your abundance to bless the poor. This is the underlying principle. You may not be a farmer, but you do have resources. What do you have? Do you have enough money to buy an extra bag of groceries for the food bank? Awesome. You have some extra time? Volunteer with a ministry maybe that serves the poor. I love that God built into the law of a country provisions for the poor. God's heart is for the poor. What other matters of compassion do we read about here? Leviticus 19:14 says, "Do not insult the deaf or cause the blind to stumble." Do not insult or make life harder for those with physical disabilities. God's heart is for the disadvantaged. How about verses 33 to 34? "Do not take advantage of foreigners who live among you in your land. Treat them like native-born Israelites and love them as you love yourself. Remember that you were once foreigners living in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." What's this about? Well, the foreigner should be treated with respect. I grew up in Aylesford in the valley. It's a little town, and not even a town. It's not even a village. I think it's a hamlet. It's really small. Anyway, they in the 1970s, apparently Aylesford was rough around. I mean, it's still kind of rough. But it was really rough. My dad grew up in Berwick, the town next to Aylesford. And he said that in the 1970s, you were always advised against stopping in Aylesford. If you were driving through, do not stop in Aylesford, because you never know what kind of hooligans are going to do something to you if you stop in that town. You know, like it's the wrong side of the tracks kind of place, right? Well, there was definitely some of that kind of stuff happening in the ancient world. Travel was dangerous. You didn't just land in any place and hope that they're going to welcome you with open arms. It was sometimes you would show up someplace and they might harm you or do something terrible to you. So this was an important lesson for them back then. When someone is coming into your community, treat them with respect. Treat them like your own. Don't assault them. Don't whatever. I think there's a good lesson for us here in Truro today in 2024. As you look around our community, as you go through the drive-thru of your favorite fast food restaurant or whatever you're doing, you're going to notice that there's a lot of people, even in our church, from different places around the world. People are coming here from all over the place. And you know what? I still hear racist things from people, even today. Not today, but like in this time, I'm still hearing people say, well, what are they doing here? They're taking our jobs, all these kinds of stuff. These are not the kinds of attitudes that God would want us to have. Treat foreigners like they're native born, God says. And even more than that, there's a message here about refugees. So refugees, often in the Old Testament times, the stranger that was coming into your community, the foreigner, was there out of necessity. They were displaced. They were coming there out of the search for safety, and they relied on the generosity of their host citizens to survive. Same thing happening today all over the world. More refugees now in the world than there ever has been in the history of our planet. And God says, love them as you love yourself. The foreigner. Love them as you love yourself. When I led a team of a committee to bring some Syrian refugees to Perth Andover, I heard so much hate from people at that time. It was awful. Oh, why you bring these terrorists here? And we need to help our own people first. What a waste of money. The heart of God is for the foreigner seeking a better life. Let's not forget that. It's really important. Okay, so on matters of compassion, there's all these sets of laws, and of course there's lots of other laws in the Old Testament too, but we're just looking at Leviticus, that commanded the people of Israel to show love and compassion for the poor, the disabled, and on the foreigners living in their country. Don't tell me that the God of the Old Testament is not a God of love and compassion. I think oftentimes we read the Old Testament and there's so many things that scare us and disturb us and confuse us, and we go, well, that God of the Old Testament doesn't look anything like the God of the New Testament, and we get very confused. And I think we need to understand that yes, there's a lot of things that we got to figure out and work out, and it's confusing at times, but at the heart, at God's heart, it's the same God reflected in Jesus. that underlying these archaic laws and things that we don't understand necessarily is this heart of God that loves and cares for people, especially disadvantaged people. Next Sunday, we're going to review some more of these commandments, these instructions from Leviticus 19, and draw out some ideas for us today. Let's wrap this up. Let's remember that the ice cream in the back pocket is the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law is what matters. I doubt you can still, if that ever truly was a law, and I'm not convinced it actually was, but if it actually was a law, I doubt that you will still find it on the books anywhere today. The laws have been updated, and I'm sure it was eliminated years ago. But the ethical principle remains. Don't steal your neighbor's vehicle. And hey, that's a real problem today. People are stealing cars like crazy, but not with ice cream in their back pocket, with crazy technology that they can break into people's vehicles. But don't steal stuff. That's the principle. So remember that we are not required as Christians under the New Covenant to follow the letter of the Old Testament law, but these laws do reveal to us the heart of our God. And the spirit of the law, the ethical principles that underlie these rules certainly still apply today, especially since the New Testament and the teachings of Jesus echo them. So today, I want us to leave this place with a spirit of self-examination. In what way can we grow this week in one of these areas that we've talked about, in areas of family and loving our family, protecting our children, honoring the elderly, and so on? Or in faithfulness to God? Are there things in our lives that have become idols that we have given a higher priority, a higher level, a degree of our attention and affection and worship than God himself? Are we distracted by things that lead us away from trusting God fully instead of fully counting on him to meet our needs? Do we have compassion adequately for the people around us who are struggling in various ways? Really think about that. In what way can you grow this week in one of those areas? Worship team, can you come, please? At the beginning of this chapter, Leviticus 19, it says, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Give the following instructions to the entire community of Israel. You must be holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy.'" We all have a lot of growing to do, myself included. I thank God for his grace. Where sin runs deep, his grace is more.